An ancient cathedral where every secret still breathes. A woman who died 3 weeks ago, yet today walks among the living, and a German colonel who saw the truth, but chose to bury it instead of report it. This isn't just a story. It's the kind of truth that hides beneath the veil of death. Tonight, I'll take you to a place where the dead never really die, and the living must sacrifice their identity to protect what matters most. The real question isn't why Sister Marie Claire faked her death, it's what she was willing to die for. And when the answer comes, you'll understand. Sometimes the biggest lies are told, just to keep the truth alive. The ruins of St. Aurelia's Cathedral rose from the heart of war-ravaged Brussels like the fossilized spine of some long-dead beast, its blackened Gothic ribs arching skyward as though in agony, silhouetted against the pale war-sick sky of autumn. Once a house of sanctity and song, now it stood hollowed and half-devoured, its western tower ripped open by relentless German shelling, leaving behind jagged edges like broken teeth gnashing at heaven. Where once the organ had thundered hymns of glory, now only the wind moaned through empty vaults, carrying with it the scent of gunpowder, damp stone, and ancient dust, and something else, something faintly coppery, like old blood never fully scrubbed from the altar. Father Malric, short and modest in build, his coat flapping slightly in the breeze like a tattered vestment, stood silently at the cathedral's threshold, umbrella clicking softly as he tapped it against the fractured flagstones beneath his boots. His eyes, deep and thoughtful, roamed the ruins not with fear but with recognition, as if the cathedral's wounds mirrored something long festering within himself. "You are the English priest," called out a voice, precise, crisp, clipped with German discipline, but oddly burdened with curiosity. A tall figure emerged from the shadows, clad in an officer's uniform so pristine it seemed untouched by war. Colonel Eric Weiss moved with calculated grace, his cold blue eyes scanning not just Malric but the architecture as if each broken buttress and cracked column told a story he was still trying to decipher. "I've read your bishop's letter," he said quietly. "You're searching for your flock, scattered sheep in a city bleeding from its own soul." Malric gave a slow nod, his gaze lifting toward a shattered stained glass window that had once depicted St. Michael triumphing over evil. Now the archangel's face was gone, replaced by a jagged hole where light poured in like a wound. "And perhaps," he murmured, "I'm here to find what lingers in the silence, in the spaces where prayers used to be." At that moment, the massive cathedral doors creaked open with a sound that made the air itself seem to recoil, and 2 shadowed figures stepped into the light like relics of a forgotten world. The first was Père Albin, the ancient sacristan, whose presence seemed stitched into the very stone of the cathedral, his spine curved with decades of devotion, his white beard matted by time, and his hands trembling not with weakness but as if they still remembered some terrible weight they had once borne. His eyes, milky with age yet disturbingly sharp, locked onto Malric's with a stare that felt like a challenge wrapped in warning. "The stones," he rasped in a voice like cracking parchment, "they whisper now, not prayers, not anymore." Weiss cleared his throat, clearly accustomed to Albin's unsettling mysticism. "He's served this cathedral longer than some of its walls," he said, "and believes it speaks to him, or through him." Beside Albin stood a boy, thin, wary, his age difficult to place thanks to the gnawing fingers of hunger and fear. His clothes hung from him like forgotten laundry, his shoes tied with fraying cord, but his eyes, dark, watchful and unblinking, held a kind of feral intelligence that made Malric take immediate notice. "This is Luke," Albin said, placing a gnarled hand on the boy's frail shoulder. "He helps me with the altar. He hears the cathedral better than I ever could." Luke lifted his chin and looked straight at Malric. "Under the altar," he said in a voice soft but certain, "there are bones, not saints, not buried by priests." The words fell into the air like ash from a distant fire, and for a long moment no one spoke, until a low gust woned through the ruined nave, whistling through broken arches and sounding like the faint toll of a bell no one had rung. In that moment, Malric felt it, the distinct chill of something unholy, buried beneath centuries of silence and stone, now beginning to stir. Something flickered in the boy's expression, not panic, not fear, but a subtle, involuntary twitch, like the echo of a memory forced suddenly to the surface, a quick, furtive glance toward the cathedral's shadow-drenched interior, where fractured pillars leaned like wounded soldiers and fractured light barely clung to the crumbling nave. Father Merrin caught it, barely, but before he could speak, Colonel Vorland's voice rose again, crisp but carrying the weight of something long buried. "We've begun restoration of the main structure," he said, gesturing toward a patch of scaffolding where dust danced like forgotten prayers. "The shelling last month destabilized more than we thought. Entire sections of stonework around the high altar have shifted. The bishop's throne is compromised." His voice was factual, but his eyes betrayed him, darting toward the chancel as if afraid of what might be watching back. The elderly deacon, Brother Norell, immediately crossed himself with a sharp, desperate motion. "You should not disturb consecrated ground that has forgotten sunlight," he muttered, his voice low and cracked like dried leaves, barely louder than the silence clinging to the marble columns. "It is not wise to stir what was meant to sleep beneath." The colonel offered a tight smile, not mockery, but perhaps denial laced with unease. "Superstition, perhaps," he said, though even he did not sound convinced. "Yet I confess, the repairs have uncovered certain anomalies. Stone corridors beneath the sanctuary, sealed chambers that weren't part of any known plan." His gaze flicked briefly toward the boy. "Perhaps, Father Merrin, you'd join us in inspecting the site. Your ecclesiastical insights may prove useful." Merrin nodded slowly, though his attention was already captured, not by the colonel, nor the deacon's trembling hands, but by the three faces before him, each heavy with unspoken burdens. The colonel, a rationalist perhaps, but with something raw lurking behind his careful diction, a hunger for knowledge that teetered on obsession. The deacon, worn by years and sorrow, whose belief in the sacred had twisted into dread. And the boy, Adrian, his silence was louder than their words, and his darting glances toward the cathedral's heart held something Merrin couldn't quite name. Fear, yes, but also guilt, or maybe recognition. They moved toward the great doors, and as they opened with the groaning reluctance of centuries disturbed, Merrin felt the air shift, colder, heavier, as if the very breath of the building changed when secrets neared exposure. Inside, light faltered. The Cathedral of St. Veritas, though wounded by war, retained a kind of grim majesty. Its great vaulted arches seemed impossibly tall, and its silence was not empty but expectant, like a breath held too long. Shafts of daylight pierced the cracked roof, illuminating dust and fractured stained glass in trembling patterns that reminded Merrin of dreams half-remembered. "The main concern lies here," Colonel Vorlin said, voice quieter now as they reached the chancel. The bishop's throne loomed at the far end, a massive chair carved in the Gothic age, its dark wood etched with angels whose faces had eroded into something more ambiguous. Now the entire platform beneath the throne had slanted, as though one corner had sunk into the earth. Adrian lingered by the altar rail, his gaze locked onto the throne as if daring it to move. Merrin saw something in the boy's posture, not just fear, but a kind of mourning. "The collapse happened 4 nights ago," Vorlin added, switching on a compact torch. "The foundation stones had settled dramatically. When we removed a few, we found a cavity, a chamber beneath. No records mention it, because it was sealed before records existed," Brother Norell said darkly. "They say the old monks once buried not bodies but knowledge. Forbidden rites, relics, curses passed down from before Christ walked among men." Adrian spoke then, softly, but with that eerie clarity children sometimes possess. "Voices echo down there," he said. "Sometimes you hear prayers, sometimes they say your name back." The torch's beam fell upon a jagged opening in the flagstones, just behind the throne. The edges were ancient, blackened with age, as though the stones themselves had resisted being moved. Merrin stepped forward, the scent of cold earth rising to meet him, tinged with something fouler, old incense and mold, and something coppery that didn't belong. The silence pressed tighter now, and in that moment the priest understood. This was no mere architectural curiosity. Something beneath this cathedral had been sealed away not just with stone, but with intention, with fear. And now, it was stirring. The chill in the crypt had grown sharper, hovering just above 15 toxers, when Father Alaric halted in his tracks, eyes narrowed, torch raised with slow precision, the beam trembling slightly in his grasp as he directed it toward the weathered stone floor beneath the cathedral's high Gothic chair, a silence hanging between them like breath before a scream. "Better I show you," he muttered finally, his voice low and uncertain, but edged with something deeper. Not fear, not exactly, but a kind of dread born of understanding. The beam slid across the cracked stone until it rested upon a patch of ancient slabs, not displaced randomly by time, but lifted deliberately, reverently, with clear intent. Below them yawned a gaping void, rectangular and precise, perhaps 4 feet long and 2 feet wide, bordered by the careful edges of hands that had known exactly what they were uncovering. As the torchlight poured into it, it revealed not the chaotic gap of geological collapse, but a chamber, deliberate, sacred, and disturbingly undisturbed for what felt like 1,000 years. This was not erosion, this was not accident, this was ritual, and what it revealed was older than memory. "A crypt," Father Alaric said quietly, though the word felt small against the gravity of what lay beneath. Not just a tomb, a statement. He leaned in, and what he saw made his breath still in his chest. Bones, unmistakably human, arranged in an order that was almost ceremonial, a complete skeleton, its limbs posed with reverence, arms folded across the chest in the manner of medieval Christian burial, the skull bowed slightly forward, as if still in penitent prayer. The bones had yellowed with deep age, the kind of age that speaks of centuries, not decades. Inscriptions in Latin ran along the inner edges of the sarcophagus, though time and weather had faded most of them into illegibility, save for a single broken phrase carved deeply into the stone: Sanctus autem vigilat etiam in tenebris, the Holy One watches even in darkness. But it was not the bones that drew the eye, it was the modern object laid directly on the chest of the ancient dead, a photograph, clean and bright, framed in smooth, unstained wood, its glass unbroken, its position too precise to be accidental. Alaric's breath caught. The woman in the photo wore the crisp white veil and deep blue cape of a Red Cross nurse, her eyes intelligent, kind and uncannily direct, as if she were staring at him across time. Sister Eloise Marchand, whispered Lieutenant Calvet behind him, voice brittle. Missing. 19 days. No signs, no leads, no witnesses. There was something in the way he said it, a tension that spoke of secrets, of deeper complications. Father Alaric turned to the others slowly. Brother Joachim had gone pale, gripping his rosary so tightly his knuckles had gone white. She prayed here often, he whispered almost to himself. Every morning before the sun. She said she heard voices calling her to heal someone long forgotten, someone waiting in the dark. In the corner of the chamber stood Thomas, the orphan boy who had accompanied them without a word. His small fists were clenched at his sides, jaw trembling, eyes locked on the photo as if he recognized it, as if he'd seen it before in dreams or nightmares. Aleci studied him quietly. The way his chest barely moved, the way his shoulders hunched inward, as if protecting some secret too heavy to carry. The photograph, Aleci murmured at last, was placed deliberately. The frame hasn't fallen, there's no dust beneath it. Whoever did this, they meant it to be seen. But by who? Calvet asked, his voice tight. And for what purpose? This crypt wasn't just hidden, it was erased from history. You'd have to know every stone of this cathedral to find it. Brother Joachim's hand trembled as he pointed down. These bones, they belonged to Saint Augustin de la Roche, a mystic healer. It is said he performed miracles in the year of famine, healing the dying with only prayer. When the old cathedral collapsed, his tomb was lost. Until now, Alachit looked between the ancient saint and the modern nurse, a healer from the distant past and a nurse who vanished in the present. The symbolism is hardly subtle. Someone wants us to understand something, a message, buried in flesh and time. The others were silent. Then the boy Thomas spoke, his voice barely audible. She told me. She said someone down there was waiting, that she'd heard his voice calling in her sleep. She said it was her turn now. Alachit froze, his heart suddenly loud in his ears. What do you mean, her turn? But Thomas just shook his head, eyes wide, terrified, and didn't speak again. And then from deep below, not from the crypt but farther, a sound began, slow, rhythmic, not the shifting of stone, not wind, a knocking, deliberate, timed, as if someone or something was responding to its name, finally being spoken aloud after centuries of silence. Coincidence, Father Moreau murmured, the words falling softly into the dense hush of the cathedral, is often the mask chosen by purpose when it wishes to remain unseen. His voice, low yet oddly resonant, seemed to brush against the cold stone pillars and travel along the vaulted ceilings like a whisper through ancient bones. Around him, the faded grandeur of St. Ambrose loomed, a church older than memory, battered by war but not broken, still holding tightly to its secrets like a miser with gold. Torchlight flickered unevenly across the carved saints and gargoyles that clung to the walls, their expressions twisted in a way that made them seem less like guardians and more like silent witnesses to something they dared not speak. In the center of the nave, they stood in a semicircle around the exposed crypt. Not a ruined grave, but something far more deliberate. Every object placed within it was positioned with a reverence that felt ritualistic, yet disturbing in its precision, as if someone had reconstructed the chamber, not as a memorial, but as a puzzle meant to be solved only by those who already knew the answer. Father Moreau's eyes swept slowly across the room. The German officer, Major Adler, with his scholar's hands wrapped tightly around a field journal, his face unreadable, but his knuckles white. Emile, the young altar boy, trying to appear invisible, yet betraying with every breath that he was more involved than he dared admit, and Captain Reinhardt, who broke the silence with a voice sharpened by tension. Sister Isabelle Fournier vanished 3 weeks ago. Last seen tending wounded resistance fighters in the lower cloisters. No one has heard from her since. His words didn't echo, they fell heavily, like stones into water, disturbing the stillness but not dissolving it. Something about the way he said it, calm but burdened, made it clear this was not just an absence, it was a disappearance wrapped in danger. The implications, unspoken but thunderous, spread through the group like the scent of old incense, mingling suspicion, grief and the ever-present threat of war. Moreau knelt near the lip of the crypt, eyes narrowing on a folded piece of fabric resting beside a stone altar, a nun's veil, pure white but smudged with soot and something darker. The smell, lavender oil, worn faint but unmistakable, turned his stomach. This hadn't been abandoned. It had been left, placed, almost offered. He turned his gaze back toward Emile, who now stood very still, as if trying to control the pace of his own breathing. Moreau studied him, not unkindly, but with a depth that seemed to pierce the boy's attempts at composure. Beneath the surface, fear churned, not just fear of what had happened, but of what he knew. "She used to come here," Emile whispered suddenly, his voice hoarse with memory. "At dawn," said, she could hear someone calling her name from beneath the stone. For a second, no one moved. Then Major Adler stepped forward, frowning. "You mean she believed she heard something?" But Emile didn't reply. His eyes were fixed on the far wall, where a section of soot-blackened stone had begun to glow faintly in the torchlight, revealing a Latin inscription, "Sanguine pactum non rumpitur." The blood pact is never broken. A chill slid down Moreau's spine, as if the very walls had exhaled. This was no ordinary disappearance. Isabel had been drawn here, not by accident, but by something older, buried and patient. The crypt, the veil, the silence that seemed to listen more than echo, all of it pointed to a pattern not shaped by grief, but by ritual. Something had been awakened, not by war but by belief, and now it was waiting, not for discovery, but for completion. The stone chamber was colder than the air outside, as if the darkness had soaked into the rock itself and settled like frost beneath the skin, and yet Dr. Elias Hartman leaned in closer, eyes gleaming behind wire-framed spectacles, as he traced each carved symbol with a reverence that bordered on obsession. His journal lay open beside him, already brimming with dozens of carefully rendered sketches and annotations so meticulous they resembled liturgical calligraphy. But something in his posture, the rigid fingers, the uneven breathing, betrayed a tension, a fevered intensity that made Father Lucien uneasy as he stood in the threshold watching. "The arrangement of the remains," Hartman whispered almost to himself, "is not burial, it's choreography." He pointed to a skeletal hand frozen mid-gesture, its fingers curled around empty air, the bones unnaturally pristine for their age. "They were posed," he continued, "intentionally, methodically, not Christian, not even pagan. This was constructed ritual. Look here." He turned his sketchpad toward Lucien, revealing a detailed drawing of the altar stone beneath the remains, concentric circles intersected with broken cruciforms and angular glyphs that defied any single origin. "You see Latin here?" "Yes," Hartman said, voice low and urgent, "but these markings, this isn't Roman, this isn't even runic. This predates the alphabet." Lucien felt a pressure build behind his temples, a headache not of pain but of presence, as if something in the room disliked being discussed aloud. He stepped forward reluctantly, noting the skeletal figure's arms crossed over the chest, traditional Christian burial style, but within the palms, something had once been placed. Whatever it was had long since rotted away, but a faint outline remained, burned into the stone like a shadow left by flame. "Someone left a symbol here," Lucien murmured, "a token or a seal." Hartman didn't answer. He had turned toward the wall, brushing away centuries of soot to reveal a faded mural, a woman in a nun's habit, her face serene but her eyes staring directly forward into the chamber. Below her, a painted inscription, "What vocem audiat qui in silentio ambulat." Lucien translated aloud, "So that he who walks in silence may hear the voice." The silence that followed was thick, pressing, broken only when Hartman asked, almost too casually, "And what do you know of Sister Magdalene Rousseau?" Lucien flinched. The name was too recent, too real. "She vanished last month, officially listed as transferred, but we both know." "No transfer was issued," Hartman finished. "She was working with the resistance, disappeared the night after she came down here." His finger tapped the sketch again. "She was cataloguing this site for the diocese. She found something, or someone." Lucien's mouth went dry. "And now you think it's connected?" Hartman's voice dropped further. "Not just connected, part of it. The photograph we found sealed behind the altar, it was hers, but the placement was deliberate. It was beneath the bone hand, wrapped in cloth soaked with myrrh. That's not a burial, that's an offering." Lucien turned slowly to look at the empty sockets of the skull resting in eternal stillness on the altar, and for a moment, just a flicker, he could have sworn its jaw had moved, the suggestion of a grin beneath the dust. "What are we really excavating here?" he asked, his voice nearly a whisper. Hartman didn't answer. He was staring at the mural now, as the light shifted and what had appeared to be aged cracks began to form words, new words, not painted, not carved, appearing, slowly, as though written from beneath the surface. Something in the room had awakened, and it was watching. The fractured sunlight filtering through the broken stained glass of St. Eustache Cathedral, scattered across the ancient stone floor like 1,000 shattered promises. Each beam caught the swirling dust in its glow, transforming it into a silent, ghostly congregation that hovered in the air, watching, waiting. There was something unnatural in the stillness of the place, not the solemn calm of holy ground, but the breathless tension of a secret too long buried. The silence was broken only by the distant echo of a bell tolling from the belfry above. Though no one had climbed its stairs in weeks, Father Anselm descended into the undercroft slowly, each step a reluctant surrender to a place that felt more like a tomb than a sanctuary. He found Brother Lucian, hunched beside a marble sarcophagus, his fingers tracing the brittle edges of an ancient ledger. The archivist's candle flickered against the damp stone walls, illuminating the carvings of forgotten saints and obscure martyrdoms. Without turning, Lucian spoke, his voice a strained whisper, as if even the stones above should not hear him. "She came here after Compline's bleeding," he said. "Sister Julienne. They say she collapsed beneath the icon of Saint Apollonia and then vanished. Vanished, Father, before anyone could reach her." Anselm frowned, his fingers tightening on the prayer beads at his side. "Vanished? Or was she taken?" he asked quietly. Lucian turned slowly, his face pale and sunken from sleepless nights. "Or she crossed over," he murmured, "into something older than sanctuary, older than faith." With shaking hands, he pulled aside a moth-eaten tapestry depicting St. Michael's triumph. Behind it, partially hidden in shadow, was an arched passage, sealed centuries ago, and now exposed as if by the cathedral's own will. They stepped into the passage, the air turned cold, and the scent shifted. No longer incense and wax, but damp stone and something metallic and ancient, like old blood. Symbols covered the walls, circles wrapped in thorns, hands clutching wounds, eyes without pupils staring out of the stone. "This isn't just crypt architecture," Lucian said, his voice nearly lost in the hush. "This is pre-Christian, older than the church. This cathedral wasn't built on sacred ground, it was built to keep something in." As they passed deeper, the tunnel widened into a vaulted chamber. There, under a cascade of candlelight from a collapsed oculus, lay a cloth bundle. Beside it, bones fragile, ancient, yet strangely rearranged, as though someone had disturbed the dead not to defile them, but to make room. On the bundle lay Sister Julienne's iron cross, darkened with age and something else, something like soot or ash. Anselm picked it up carefully. It was warm. Lucian pulled a sealed envelope from beneath his robe. Inside was a faded photograph, Sister Julienne kneeling beside a wounded soldier, her hand pressed against his side, not like a medic, but like a priest giving absolution. "This soldier never appeared in any registry," Lucian whispered. "Not allied, not Axis. No one knows who he was or where he went. But after this, Sister Julienne changed. She began to pray in languages we couldn't place. She fasted for days without weakening, and then she disappeared." Father Anselm studied the cross again, his mind turning over the unspoken implications. "You believe she was called?" he asked slowly. Lucian nodded, eyes dark. "No, I believe," she answered. "There is something beneath this cathedral, something that waits for the wounded, not to heal them, but to use them, to transform them into something else. The sanctuary isn't for the living, Father. It's for those in between." Above them the bells began to toll again. No one had touched the rope. The crypt trembled ever so slightly, the air thickening with a weight that pressed against the chest, like the pressure before a scream. Anselm turned toward the exit, but the light had changed. The shadows were longer, moving, reaching. "She's not dead," Lucian said behind him, his voice hollow with certainty. "Not buried. She walks between the stones now. She serves something older than Rome, and she is not alone." A whisper rose then, not a sound but a sensation, brushing against the ear like a breath not drawn by human lungs. The carvings on the walls seemed to pulse with quiet rhythm, like the slow heartbeat of something sleeping beneath them. Anselm clutched the cross tightly, suddenly unsure if it was protection or a key. He turned to Lucian. "Whatever she serves, it still wants more." And as the candle flickered out and the last bell fell silent, both men realized they were no longer alone in the crypt. Father Elric leaned in slightly, his eyes fixed gently on the trembling form of Brother Thaddeus, whose gnarled hands quivered not merely from age but from the unbearable strain of remembering things that never truly left him, things that had festered in the cracks of silence for decades. "In the early years," the old monk began, voice brittle and frayed like old parchment, "it was nothing more than faint echoes, footsteps trailing through empty corridors long after Compline, whispers like breath against the stone that seemed to rise from the confessionals even when no one had entered. I dismissed them as creaks of old timber, drafts through the belfry, the ordinary noises of a place too ancient to be silent. But over time those murmurs found shape." He paused, crossing himself with an almost desperate fervor, as if the very memory demanded protection. "I began to see them, first just shadows slipping across the transept at midnight, too fluid to be flesh, and too purposeful to be wind. Then clearer figures, monks in robes of undying white, gliding through the aisles as if on sacred procession, their chants more haunting than holy. Latin, yes, but not of this world." It was flawless and terrifying, so divine that my own tongue felt profane in contrast. Father Elric remained still, absorbing every word as the candlelight danced across Thaddeus's face, revealing a sorrow carved by years of trying to forget what had imprinted itself on his soul. "Did these visions bring fear?" Elric asked. "At first, yes," Thaddeus whispered. "I thought it was madness, or perhaps a calling, something divine I wasn't worthy to receive, but then came peace. The figures never threatened, they passed like caretakers, tending to the unseen, laying invisible hands upon the air as if blessing someone I could not see. But 3 weeks ago, they changed. Their movements grew swift, almost frantic, and among them I saw her, a woman, clad in white, yes, but different. She glowed not with the stillness of the saints but with the ache of the living. Her face, it was not peaceful, it was pleading. She wept without tears, her eyes searching, always looking toward the altar where the old bishop's crypt had been, long sealed, but recently unearthed." Elric felt a chill rise at the base of his neck. "Did she speak to you?" he asked gently. "Not with words," Thaddeus murmured, his voice hollow, "but her eyes screamed, they begged. She lifted her hands again and again, as though offering something or warning me, I still cannot tell. And then, I saw the grave open. Not disturbed by shovels or men, but as if something beneath had pushed its way upward, and she stood above it, not kneeling in prayer, but standing in defiance, or agony, or both. Her face, Father, it bears no peace. It's the face of someone trapped, not in life, not in death, but somewhere between." The candle's flame sputtered, and a gust of wind curled through the broken archway of the chancel, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and something older, incense long extinguished. Elric placed a hand on the old monk's arm, grounding him. "Brother Thaddeus," he asked, voice soft yet firm, "do you believe this woman is a ghost?" The monk looked upward, his eyes locking with the cracked statue of the Madonna above. "No," he said after a long silence, "I believe she is waiting for release, for judgment, for someone to listen." "She walks the midnight aisle, not as a shade, but as a sentinel, and until we understand what was buried beneath that throne, she will not leave, because she cannot. And I fear," he added, voice barely audible, "that whatever she guards is not resting, it is stirring. In the shattered heart of St. Elwi's Cathedral, where vines crept through broken stained glass, and pigeons nested where angels once watched in stone, Father Elwi ascended the twisted remains of the bell tower, in search of the boy the city had long forgotten, a thin, ragged shadow named Jules, whose eyes had seen far more than any child should, and whose silence held weight like prophecy. Evening light spilled in streaks of bruised gold through the gaps left by mortar fire, casting the city below in strange contrasts, steeples rising defiantly against the horizon, while barracks and barbed wire cut across the landscape like stitches over a wound that refused to close. Jules sat alone at the edge, perched on a scorched beam like a sentinel too young to carry such sorrow, his bare feet dangling into open air, as though he dared heaven to lift him away. Father Elioi approached slowly, his steps careful over fractured stone, not wanting to break the spell or the boy's fragile trust. The colonel asked about her again. Jules said before Elioi could speak, his voice quiet but steady, as if the words had been waiting in his chest like caged birds. "About Sister Agnes." There was no need for explanation. Everyone in the ruins of Leoi knew of the nun who had disappeared the night the abbey was shelled, vanishing without a trace while others burned. Rumors swirled like smoke. Some said she was taken by soldiers, others that she'd betrayed the resistance. But Jules knew better. He didn't just believe, he'd seen. "She didn't run," he said, eyes fixed on the horizon. "She didn't scream. She walked down into the crypt by herself, carrying something wrapped in red silk, humming a tune I never heard before, like a lullaby meant for ghosts." Ey crouched beside him, heart pounding, not from fear but recognition, as if some ancient truth had stirred in the air. "What did you see, mon fils?" he asked gently, but Jules' hands were already clenched, knuckles white with memory. "There were figures waiting for her," he whispered, his voice a thread on the edge of breaking. "They weren't soldiers, they weren't alive, their faces were hidden, but I felt them looking through me, as if they'd been here long before the cathedral was ever built. She didn't flinch. She walked right into their midst like she belonged to them." He paused, eyes blinking against tears, and then she was gone. They were gone. No sound, no smoke, just stillness. The wind shifted through the tower, carrying a faint scent of burnt incense and old stone. Ayode said nothing, letting the silence deepen, for it held something more sacred than words. "Sometimes," Jules continued, "I still see her, just out of the corner of my eye, standing near the old altar where the sun still hits the broken glass at dawn. Sometimes I hear her singing, soft, like it's meant for those who can't die properly." His voice dropped further, "and sometimes I see them too, watching from the crypt stairs, never moving, never speaking, just waiting, like the cathedral belongs to them now. The priest felt a chill crawl down his spine, not fear but reverence. There were mysteries the church had no name for, miracles that never asked for recognition, only witnesses. "Do you think she chose it?" Ayode asked. Jules nodded, his voice hollow with knowing. She stayed for them, for the forgotten, for the ones no one dared pray for anymore. And in that moment, with the sun vanishing and the city exhaling its sorrow below them, Ayode knew that something eternal had taken root in the ruins, something not bound by war or reason, or even death. It was not just Sister Agnès who had vanished into legend, it was the thin veil between the seen and the unseen, between salvation and sacrifice, between the child who watched from the shadows and the holy woman who walked into them willingly. And as night claimed the last light of day, Father Ayode wondered, not with doubt, but with awe, if the angels Jules had seen were not sent to save Sister Agnès, but to follow her, carefully, deliberately, as if bound to an oath no one else could hear. The figures moved through the cathedral's ruined nave, their steps soundless against the fractured stone. They wore no golden vestments, no royal symbols of divinity, only simple white robes, luminous in the moonlight, stained faintly with something too dark to be dust. These were not angels of heaven, but of suffering, human angels perhaps, forged in the crucible of war and shaped by mercy rather than miracles. Their robes whispered through the still air like pages turning in an ancient, unreadable book. The silence of the moment was not peace, but anticipation, like the breath held before a storm or the hush before a revelation. "I couldn't sleep," the boy whispered, his voice barely more than the wind through broken glass. He stood before Father René in the half-light of a crumbling tower, eyes hollow with too many nights without rest. "Not from nightmares, but from hunger. I'd hoped that praying might ease the pain in my belly." His words trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of what they carried. "That's when I saw them moving in the chancel. 3 of them. They didn't see me. I stayed hidden in the shadows near the confessional." His breath caught, as if unsure whether to continue. 2 of them were carrying bundles, white bundles, wrapped carefully, reverently, about the size of, he faltered, eyes lowering, of a person. Father René said nothing, only nodded, his silence patient and full of listening, not judgment. The boy took strength from it, continued. "The 3rd figure was different. She gave orders without speaking, just with her hands, calm, certain, like Sister Marguerite used to be when she stitched wounds by candlelight, even when the bombs were falling. They moved like they'd done this before, not in panic, in purpose." "And what happened next?" the priest asked gently. "They didn't bury them," the boy replied, fists tightening against his coat. "Not in the earth. They laid the bundles beneath the bishop's throne, in the old crypt we found last week. But it wasn't like hiding them, they made it look sacred." His voice grew distant, haunted. "They took the old bones, the ones that were scattered, and placed them around the bundles, not randomly, like guardians, like the stone saints watching over the cathedral doors. It felt like they were building a shrine, not a grave." Father René's breath slowed. The boy was not exaggerating. He was recounting something almost ritualistic, something older than the war itself. The idea of creating a sacred illusion of death, to preserve something deeper, something alive, was both unsettling and beautiful. "There's more," the boy said after a long pause. "After they arranged everything, the leader, the woman, she pulled something from beneath her robe, a small object, wrapped in red cloth. She placed it in the center of the bones, like the heart of the shrine." He hesitated, then added, "She moved like a woman. You can tell, even under robes, there's a kind of grace, but a heavy one, like someone carrying grief." Father René leaned forward slightly. "You saw her face." The boy nodded slowly, as if confessing something sacred, just for a moment. When she leaned into the candlelight, it was Sister Marguerite. Her eyes were the same, sharp and tired, not afraid, but knowing. A heavy silence followed, like the cathedral itself was listening. After that they disappeared, into the shadows. I waited until dawn. They never came back through the doors. It was like the cathedral swallowed them whole. The priest closed his eyes briefly. In this boy's story, he recognized something powerful, an act that defied both death and explanation. It was not a burial. It was a transformation, a deliberate disguise to protect life beneath the mask of death. Perhaps Sister Marguerite had not died at all. Perhaps she had simply passed into another form of service, one that required silence, darkness, and the protection of secrecy. "Do you believe she's still alive?" he asked softly. The boy looked out the shattered window, where the last light of day was bleeding into the bruised blue of wartime dusk. "I believe she found a way to keep healing," he whispered, "even when the world thinks her work is finished." Father René sat back, heart heavy with revelation. What the boy had witnessed was not a miracle in the heavenly sense, but something even rarer. A sacrament performed in secret by human hands with divine intention. A false grave to preserve real hope. A monument of bones and lies built not to deceive but to protect. In that ruined cathedral amid blood and ash, Sister Marguerite had become more than a nurse. She had become a myth wrapped in white linen, vanishing not to escape but to endure. The morning unfolded beneath a heavy sky, its grey veil casting an almost reverent stillness across the ancient streets that clustered around the cathedral. Father Dumas walked alone, his footsteps echoing softly against the cobbled paths as if the very stones beneath him were whispering secrets long buried. These narrow, winding alleys seemed soaked in 1,000 unspoken stories, some etched into the moss-covered walls by the hands of time, others hidden within the hearts of those who had lived through war, fear, and faith. There was a strange tension in the air, a sacred weight that only certain souls could feel. Father Dumas was one of them. He had risen before dawn, not out of habit but because of that peculiar unrest which plagues a man when scattered fragments of truth begin aligning themselves into a pattern too precise to be coincidence. A pattern that did not merely suggest answers but warned of dangers cloaked in holiness. His destination was a modest stone house tucked along Rue des Martyrs, belonging to Madame Henriette Valcourt, a widow whose quiet suffering had made her something of a monument in the neighborhood. Her home bore the humble dignity of genteel poverty, a space where grief had long since become furniture. Inside, old photographs of her late husband, a respected physician taken by the war's early cruelty, gazed silently from the walls. His medical books, yellowed and stiff with age, still lined the shelves as though awaiting his return. Father Dumas was welcomed into a small parlor, its curtains drawn to keep out the morning chill, and the scent of lavender and old paper hung in the air like memory itself. She was not just a nurse to us, Madame Valcourt said, her voice low and measured, as if speaking too loudly might disturb something sacred. Marie-Claire brought light into this house when the world outside had gone dark. She folded her weathered hands on her lap, eyes glassy with the weight of remembrance. My grandson Luc had been injured badly when the Germans entered the city. A piece of shrapnel in his shoulder. It should have been treatable, but the hospitals were reserved for German soldiers. We had nothing. No medicine, no morphine, no doctors. We could only watch him burn with fever and cry out in delirium. Father Dumas leaned forward gently. And then she came. Madame Valcourt nodded slowly, almost reverently. It was past midnight. A knock at the door, not loud, not urgent, but certain, and there she stood, dressed plainly as always, with a leather satchel in one hand and a candle in the other. No explanation, no introductions. She said she had heard there was suffering here, that someone in pain had called out, perhaps not with words but in spirit, and that she had come to answer. I never did learn who told her, or how she knew. It was as if she simply knew where she was needed. "She treated your grandson?" Father Dumas asked, though he already knew the answer. With hands steadier than any I've ever seen, the widow whispered. She opened the wound, removed the shrapnel with tools that looked too refined for someone who claimed to be just a nurse. She cleaned the flesh, dressed it, and never once let Luc fall into despair. She told him stories, tales of Saint Genevieve and the miracles she worked during times of war. She said healing wasn't just about the body, it was about the soul, that every wound was part of a greater battle between mercy and cruelty, and that Luc's recovery would echo far beyond this house. And did she return, he asked. Twice more, Madame Valcourt replied, to check on Luc's healing, but each time she seemed more distant. We came to realize our home was but one stop on a longer journey. She spoke of others, soldiers hidden in basements, children orphaned and sick, men who had escaped from prison camps but were too injured to flee the city. She never gave names or locations, only said there are souls in pain and God has no shortage of work. She operated quietly, precisely, a hidden network, one that stitched together the city's broken pieces with invisible thread. Father Dumas was silent, but his mind raced. This network, was it connected to the cathedral? The widow hesitated, her expression suddenly grave. In part, she mentioned a place beneath the cathedral. A crypt, but not the public one. She said it had once been a place for penance, centuries ago. Now it served a different kind of confession. There were whispers, farther of tunnels that ran beneath the cathedral and out into the old hospital quarters, abandoned since the occupation. Some say she used those tunnels to smuggle the wounded. Some say she used them to hide things, people, supplies, perhaps truths too dangerous to speak aloud. Father Dumas felt the air around him grow colder. The pattern was clearer now, but more troubling. Marie-Claire had not simply been helping the sick. She had been part of something greater, something hidden behind the walls of piety and silence, a movement of compassion cloaked in secrecy. And if what Madame Valcourt suggested was true, then those tunnels did not just carry medicine and bodies, they carried secrets. Secrets someone might kill to protect. She told me once, Madame said, her voice trembling slightly, that not all wounds bleed, some lie buried, deep in the heart, and that healing them sometimes demands that we become ghosts ourselves. And in that moment, Father Dumas understood, the missing nurse wasn't just a nurse. She was a spectre of mercy, a shadow that walked between worlds, the seen and the unseen, the wounded and the forgotten. But someone had made her disappear, and the only way to find her now was to follow the ghosts she left behind. The storm had not yet broken, but the sky above Vienna was already bruised with the weight of something ancient, something that felt less like weather and more like reckoning. In the heart of the city, the Church of St. Florian stood, not just as a monument of faith, but as a relic of hidden wars and whispered prayers, its gargoyles darkened by centuries of smoke and blood. Father Ilian moved slowly beneath its vaulted arches, his eyes drawn again and again to a forgotten recess beneath the northern transept, once believed sealed since the 30 Years' War. But it was no longer sealed. Word had come from an old clockmaker, dying of pneumonia and guilt, that the room had been opened 3 weeks ago by a woman cloaked in grey, bearing neither name nor fear, who spoke Latin like it was her native tongue, and asked only for silence. They said she carried a book bound in scarred leather, a surgeon's kit wrapped in oilcloth, and a crucifix whose center was engraved not with a figure of Christ, but with a sigil no one dared interpret. The deeper Father Ilian investigated, the more pieces emerged, city registrars erased, hospital reports falsified, a string of wounded soldiers whose official deaths were quietly revoked after midnight visits from a nun who, it was rumored, had been executed 2 winters ago by the Gestapo. Yet here she was again, in sketches, in testimonies, in the margins of resistance notes found stitched into the lining of an old priest's stole, walking through walls, slipping past checkpoints, performing surgeries in basements beneath bakeries. The trail grew colder with every new discovery, not because it vanished but because it sank into tunnels, into catacombs, into the memories of people too afraid to remember. Ilian confronted one of the last known witnesses, a blind cantor who once sang during wartime funerals. He said she told him the church was not a building but a living wound, and she was the needle that stitched the broken pieces of it back together. She had warned that the true war was not fought with bullets or flags but with the decision to save even one soul at great cost. Her final words to him had chilled his blood. If they announce my death, rejoice, for only then can I truly live. And now, with intelligence reports suggesting the reactivation of a hidden medical corridor under St. Florian's and unmarked graves appearing where none had been before, Father Ilian realized the terrifying truth that her death had not ended her mission but become its shield. She had become an idea wrapped in flesh, a martyr of her own invention, whose resurrection was not of body but of purpose. The saints were not returning, they had simply never left. And in the silence of that cathedral, where every stone had once absorbed a cry for mercy, the echoes were returning, louder and more urgent than ever, warning him that the line between sanctuary and betrayal was not merely thin, it was vanishing. The storm outside groaned like a restless spirit as Father Alaric stood in the vaulted hush of the abbey's inner sanctum, its stained glass windows casting fractured twilight over ancient stone floors, while Inspector Renaud, once a scholar of antiquities turned reluctant wartime enforcer, paced silently beneath a crucifix that had witnessed centuries of whispered absolutions. "This investigation cannot remain open forever," Renaud murmured, though his voice betrayed more weariness than resolve. "Higher command demands resolution. They view the disappearance of Sister Elaric as a procedural inconvenience." Father Alaric's gaze did not waver from the candlelit altar. "When a soul vanishes from this world without trace, the earth itself stirs. This is no procedural matter, Inspector. It is a parable written in living flesh." Renaud turned, his fingers twitching over the satchel that held both military dossiers and the old monastic blueprints he had once studied as a student. "You speak in riddles." "I speak of signs," Alaric replied gently, "of things left hidden in plain sight, of truths carved beneath centuries of dust." He stepped slowly toward the ancient wooden chair once reserved for inquisitors of long-dead orders, and sat with deliberate calm. Sister Elarica did not perish. She vanished by design, and not alone. Renaud stiffened. "You have evidence." "Only the evidence that speaks without words," Alaric said, raising his hand to count each point like a rosary bead. 1. The pattern of relics found in the sacristy, arranged not in haste but with sacred geometry, points to concealment, not burial. 2. The boy Lucian did not see a funeral but a ritual of passage. His drawings prove that. 3. The hidden cistern beneath the cloisters, dry for centuries, was recently disturbed, suggesting movement underground. 4. The confessions I've heard in these walls speak not of death but of loyalty, silence and pilgrimage. Renaud's eyes narrowed. "And your 5th point, you, Inspector," Alaric said softly, "you possess knowledge that exceeds your brief. The very fact that you have not shut this place down reveals your conflict." Silence fell between them like a thick veil. Finally Renaud spoke, his voice low and hollow. My father was born in these mountains. He told me stories of saints who vanished into the fog, only to return when the land bled. When I learned what she was doing, sheltering partisans, smuggling wounded through the wine cellars and out into the shepherd paths, I faced orders that demanded arrests, and a conscience that demanded reverence. He opened his satchel, spreading blueprints on the altar with trembling fingers. She knew the passages better than any living soul, but someone had to guide her to them. She came to me, not with a plea but a plan. She said that sanctity could wear the mask of death if it meant saving lives. She staged her disappearance like a martyr, weaving her absence into a myth that could outlive her body. Alaric closed his eyes, the flicker of the candles dancing across his weathered face. A living saint, or a ghost with purpose, Renaud muttered. The higher-ups believe she is dead. But in the past 2 weeks, 3 Allied escapees have been found across the border, each wearing a rosary carved from the same wood as our altar. Alaric opened his eyes slowly, the pieces sliding into place like the final turn of a centuries-old lock. Then the legend grows. And legends, Inspector, do not die quietly. Outside, thunder cracked, and somewhere in the undercroft, the sound of dripping water echoed like footsteps retreating into the bones of the earth. The rain traced trembling lines across the cathedral windows like tears on ancient glass, each droplet a whisper of memory, a fragment of some buried truth, and Colonel Severin, staring through them, seemed to search for the face the world had declared dead, yet whose work pulsed stronger than ever in silence. The photograph found in the crypt had not been a farewell but a message, a cipher to those who understood, a cover for those who investigated. Father Ilya absorbed this revelation with the quiet stillness of a man listening to the cracks forming in the foundations of his understanding. The puzzle he thought he'd solved was now unraveling into something deeper. "And you helped construct this lie?" he asked. Zimmerman, eyes weary but unashamed, answered, "I helped ensure that what appeared false could breathe like truth. My knowledge, my guilt, and my silence became part of something greater." His architectural expertise had woven a deception so intricately bound to medieval burial rites that it misled inspectors and enlightened believers in equal measure, a rebellion grounded in scholarship, or perhaps the decision of a man who could no longer prosecute mercy as if it were a crime. The colonel turned again to the window, where his reflection shimmered in the rain, a face worn by the years of serving 2 masters, duty and conscience, each pulling him apart. "But this won't remain hidden," he murmured. "In 2 days, German engineers will examine every stone, every corridor, every shadowed chamber. If any hidden sanctuary still exists, they will find it." The weight of his words thickened the air like a storm rolling into the presbytery. Father Elior knew then that this wasn't a mystery to be solved but a truth to be protected. The cathedral, which had for centuries cradled the broken and the hunted within its stone embrace, now faced a modern adversary, one that measured faith with blueprints and stripped secrets with steel. Sister Aurelie, presumed martyred by the world, still moved quietly beneath the sanctuary's foundations, healing those whose names had been erased, kept alive only in whispered prayers. But the delicate tapestry shielding her life was unraveling fast. "How long do we truly have?" Father Elior asked. 2 days, Zimmerman replied grimly. 3, if the weather delays them. Elior rose, not just from a chair but into a decision. He understood now that knowledge was no longer enough. Action was the only language left. That evening he led them into the depths of the crypt. Severin, Zimmerman, and young Emile followed, each burdened by their own truths, their own losses. The narrow tunnels echoed with centuries of whispered confessions and forgotten vows. Every stone seemed to breathe with stories not yet told. What they were about to uncover would not simply reshape their understanding of Sister Aurelie's disappearance, it would shatter their assumptions about death, duty, and the fragile line between law and compassion. For her sacrifice had not been a death, but a symbol, a living testament that some souls continue their mission beyond burial. Yet now the question was no longer what happened to Sister Aurelie. The question was what would happen because of her, because once the light found her truth, would it preserve her or extinguish her forever? As the cathedral's bell tolled faintly in the rain-drenched twilight, its echo threading through the marrow of ancient stone, Father Aurelius stood motionless beneath the nave's vast dome, his gaze drawn not to the heavens, but to the shifting shadows near the altar steps, where something or someone stirred with the hush of breath long held. The deadline was set, unyielding and cold, and every action taken now had to be complete before the hourglass bled its final grain. Yet even as the others discussed strategy, Father Aurelius's attention was arrested by a sound, not the groaning of timbers nor the sigh of wind, but a rhythm too deliberate, too alive. "Brother Silvanus," he murmured, "the visions you shared of pale figures tending silent wounded, it may be time to bring that truth into the light." The elder monk, once skeptical, now paled, understanding the weight behind the words. "You mean to expose the sanctuary?" "No," Aurelius replied with quiet intensity. "I intend to reveal the living grace hidden within it." Without awaiting consent, he approached the weathered staircase spiraling into the undercroft and called out with deliberate calm, "Sister Eleonora, I believe it is time to rise." The silence that followed was almost unbearable. Then came the whisper of fabric gliding across stone, like a forgotten hymn returning from exile. Slowly a figure ascended, robed in white, her posture regal despite the wear of underground survival. It was unmistakably her, not a ghost, not a rumor, but the real Sister Eleonora, thought martyred weeks before, now alive and radiant with the solemn serenity of one who had walked through death's corridor and chosen to remain among the living. Her Red Cross insignia was gone. In its place the humility of cloth that bore no title, only purpose. "You have impeccable timing," she said to Aurelius with a calm that defied the storm above. "As do you," he replied, though his eyes betrayed the depth of his concern. A small voice broke the reverence. Young Luca stepped forward, defiant and shaking. "She saved me," he said. "She saved all of us. If they take her, they take me too." Eleonora touched the boy's shoulder gently. "Luca, you've been brave enough. Now let the truth speak for itself." "Indeed," Aurelius added, "and let it speak boldly, for the time of hiding has passed." Then from the periphery, Commander Wren stepped into view. Stoic, unreadable, but unmistakably changed. According to military record, he began, his voice steady. "Sister Eleonora died in the collapse of St. Lyria's infirmary. The file is sealed. The investigation concluded. And yet here I stand," she replied softly, "unsealed and unconcluded." Wren gave a measured nod. "The woman who died was a nurse and a suspect. The woman standing here is someone else, perhaps a helper in the archives, perhaps a quiet presence who keeps vigil over the dead." Aurelius recognized the brilliance in Wren's phrasing, a resurrection not of the body but of identity, a bureaucratic salvation. "The world may not know she lives," Aurelius said, "but she will continue to serve in the quiet light." "And my final report," Wren added, "will state that the cathedral's substructures hold no strategic significance, merely ancient alcoves used for storing forgotten relics. Any injured individuals found within shall be classified as lost German conscripts evading the Eastern Front, not Allied collaborators." Eleonora's eyes met his, not with gratitude, but understanding. They were co-conspirators now in a truth too fragile to name. A silence settled again, deeper than before, as if the cathedral itself had exhaled a secret. The resurrection had occurred, but not in the way the world expected. And outside the storm began to wane, as if even the heavens knew that something sacred had just been reborn. A centuries-old abbey hidden deep in the frost-bitten hills of northern Jura stood silent under the weight of snow-laden pines, its candle-lit chapels casting faint golden auras against ancient stone walls. Inside, a secret whispered its final breath. Bishop Lorenz, frail yet fierce in gaze, lowered an ornate key into a crypt chamber floor behind the altar, his hand trembling not from age but from the knowledge of what was being sealed away. The war had broken men, nations, and oaths, but what lay beneath the abbey had the power to shatter faith itself. For months, Father Elian, a former codebreaker turned reluctant chaplain, had followed scattered clues from intercepted messages and Vatican archives, all leading here to the dormant choir. A legend spoken only in the riddled footnotes of suppressed theological texts, a sect of healers believed to perform sacred resurrections through forgotten rituals, disappearing during the Black Plague, and believed to have survived in secret ever since. As dusk fell like a heavy curtain, muffling sound and time, Elian stepped into the crypt's cold silence, guided by candlelight and intuition. There, beneath crumbling statues of forgotten saints, he found them, not corpses, but 13 living figures in silver robes, motionless in meditative trance, their breath imperceptible, their existence nearly ethereal. At their center stood Sister Aurelie, the abbey's long-lost archivist, declared dead in a 1942 Gestapo raid. Yet here she was, unmistakably alive, her pulse steady, her eyes slowly opening, as if waking from a dream spun through centuries. "You should not have come," she whispered, voice dry yet resolute. "And yet," Elian replied, "some truths refuse burial." From the shadows emerged Brother Reno, the abbey's mute caretaker, now speaking fluently in Latin as though possessed, revealing that the group had preserved wounded partisans and even enemy soldiers alike, using pre-Christian rites that blurred the line between science, sanctity, and sacrilege. Their survival depended not on evading death, but mastering the illusion of it. Outside, soldiers approached, the final German patrol before retreat. Father Elian faced a choice: expose the miracle and risk its destruction, or weave a lie so precise it could pass as gospel. He addressed the commanding officer with steady calm. "This chamber holds only the bones of plague victims, sealed since the 14th century. Any further intrusion risks contagion." The officer recoiled instinctively, signaling retreat, never knowing how close he'd come to the impossible. In the days that followed, Elian documented everything, encrypted, hidden in the marginalia of a fabricated architectural report, coded in Gregorian musical notations. Aurelie and the others were reassigned identities: silent nuns, cleaning staff, forgotten relic keepers. The abbey continued its rituals above, while below, the dormant choir prepared for the suffering yet to come, unseen, unsung, but more alive than any chronicle could confess. As Elian departed, snow falling like ash around him, he understood: some mysteries are not solved but entrusted, and some saints walk among the living, cloaked not in canonization but in silence, waiting for the world to need them again. The abbey faded behind him, its secrets intact, its truth preserved not in revelation but in the careful choice to let it remain hidden until the world is ready.